as we do, there are people walking around with one-page handouts that Dr. Maher has produced for us to go along with his speech. Dan Maher joins us from Ave Maria University, where he is a new addition as a faculty member. He is formerly of the Catholic University of America, where he taught both undergraduates and graduate students. He has earned a BA and MA from the Catholic University of America and earned his PhD at Boston College. His specializations include ancient Greek philosophy, early modern philosophy, and medical ethics. He is here today to speak to us on the goodness of health. Please join me in welcoming Dan Maher.
Thank you. I don't have pictures, unfortunately, but I do hope you get a copy of the quotations that I plan to draw upon. It makes it a little easier to focus on those as we go along. It's very good to be here as a part of this conference. I'm glad the opportunity to reflect upon the themes that are identified in the conference title, Healthcare in an Increasingly Health-Obsessed Culture. This title itself has given me much to think about. It has a self-referential character, a mildly ironic tone that invites some suspicion. To be health-obsessed sounds to me like something bad, and yet this is also, or primarily, a conference on healthcare. It would not be surprising if health-obsessed people were to hold a conference on healthcare, but there would be something strange about calling attention to one's own obsession. It's as if this popular magazine that we see in the grocery stores, Self, this magazine Self, it's as if it had a subtitle, Self, Magazine for Narcissists. So, healthcare in an increasingly health-obsessed culture. Just as I would not want to be seen buying such a magazine, I have my doubts about attending such a conference. Does the conference itself instantiate this increasingly bad obsession with health? Or does the conference step back from that? Step back from the health obsession that grips others in the surrounding culture and thereby gain insight or a healthy perspective with which to combat the momentum of this obsession. On such a view, participation in this conference identifies one as enlightened, or at least as having diagnosed that there is a problem with an obsessive attitude that others have towards health. It makes the conference more respectable, just as my magazine would be more respectable if it were called Self, a magazine about narcissism. I doubt that the questionable character of the conference title can be resolved that simply. For we who think about and try to understand health or promote health, and health care can not only be concerned about health as it is found in others. We, all of us, as living animals, cannot fail to be concerned with our own health, which is identical at bottom with concern for our very lives. We do not enjoy the liberty of beings that could take a purely theoretical interest in health. And so we cannot examine health without taking notice that we ourselves, too, become an object of study. As we try to understand health, inevitably we show up within the subject we are trying to understand. When we speak about health, always, at least indirectly, we speak about ourselves. Suddenly, we too appear to be obsessed with health, and perhaps to be somewhat narcissistic, at least because we appear to be especially concerned with our own concerns. In this context, then, to speak of health obsession does more than identify the subject matter of one's conference. It implies an alternative to obsession, a healthy concern with health. By virtue of a conference with this title, then, we might be understood to concentrate our attention on health in order to free the culture, or perhaps ourselves, from this unhealthy obsession. Does a conference of this sort recommend a Nietzschean maneuver according to which the remedy for our specific malady arises only through embracing our sickness more profoundly? To the extent that our thinking has been shaped by a health-obsessed culture, perhaps we need special efforts to free ourselves from our condition before we can think more clearly and more naturally about our situation. In this view, a conference with this title amounts to a step toward a healthier, less obsessed attitude towards health. those introductory remarks about the conference title that I don't intend to leave entirely behind. I'd like to divide my remarks into three parts. In the first part, I would like to make some introductory remarks about a sort of array in which we might think about health or about the goodness of health. Secondarily, I would like to focus on comments made by Gadamer in one essay, where he identifies an important obstacle that confronts us when we try to do that. And then thirdly, I'd like to look, taking a hint from Gadamer about what to do when we have so much trouble identifying what health is and why it's good. Take a hint from him and then contrast two separate ways in which we might approach that problem. So three parts, an array of views about health, a little hint from Gadamer, and then a contrast between especially ancient and modern ways of looking at health and the goodness of health. So setting the conference title considerations to one side, at least for the moment, this title does force us to recognize that being health-obsessed is not identical with being healthy. A sign of this is that the health-obsessed, people who are health-obsessed, still need, and perhaps increasingly need, health care. The character of the urgency of their demand introduce new pressures on those who deliver health care. And I'm confident that at least many of these pressures will be addressed in this conference. I would like to direct our attention to another matter that is more fundamental, in a sense simpler, but still somewhat difficult to bring clearly to mind. I need to focus attention on what we mean by health. To define health is notoriously difficult. The World Health Organization has offered one very famous definition. That's the first item on your paper, that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Expansive definitions of this sort make it difficult to see how one should or could be anything but obsessed with health. Moreover, they are unpersuasive insofar as they seem to define any human trouble as a health problem. If my colleagues are gossiping about me, and this detracts from my social well-being, exactly which physician should I see? And even if I find one who has a pill that makes me forget about these problems, has that physician healed me? Like the ethics drug, I have my own recommendations for the drug committee. They ought to, or drug companies, they ought to produce what I call logo contraception. That's, you have the urge to say things in public and or in front of people that you shouldn't say them in front of. Logo contraception would insulate you from any effects from what you said. You could say whatever you liked, and the effects would never come back. That would be nice. That would eliminate any problems. If we resist these all-inclusive, expansive definitions of health, we might find ourselves aligned at the other end of the spectrum with someone like Aristotle, who defines health or identifies health as the perfection of virtue appropriate to what he calls the nutritive part of the soul, the part operative in nutrition, metabolism, reproduction. Aristotle makes this identification in his Nicomachean Ethics, and then promptly excludes this part of the soul and health from any constitutive role in his account of properly human happiness. This exclusion often sounds strange to contemporary ears, for we seem to think that health has greater moral significance. Even if we agree with Aristotle that a human being does not deserve moral praise on account of having good digestion, it is fairly common to attach some moral significance to taking care of one's health, which proves to be something that Aristotle too eventually acknowledges. Accordingly, the various efforts nowadays to encourage people to quit smoking, to improve their diets, to exercise, in traditional language, these are moralistic efforts. Health is now widely regarded as unquestionably good. The prominence of the pursuit of health in American life is overwhelming. We have health clubs, we have food labels and warnings, medical news, the politics of healthcare surround us and shape our lives. A few years ago, a major health insurer used the slogan, "Your health is everything." Now, few people probably accept that literally, but often our public discourse seems to assume that health is the most important thing, concern for health transcend political and religious differences. They are often believed to trump any moral scruples we might have. Thus, the arguments made in the name of health advantages, are sometimes presented as silencing, or at least decisively weakening moral qualms about such activities as needle exchange programs, condom distribution, embryonic stem cell research. That the goodness or badness of these activities should be determined exclusively or decisively by appeal to health consequences is one way, but only one way, to understand the goodness of health. Aristotle himself seemed to recognize this type of understanding of something akin to it, namely the belief that health is the decisive human good. In Book 7, Nicomachean Ethics, where he is defending the goodness of pleasure, despite pleasure's power to overwhelm the rational or thinking elements in human beings, at that point, he presents us with the following complicated proportion, also on your paper. The view that pleasures are bad because some pleasant things are unhealthy is like saying that healthy things are bad. That healthy things are bad because some healthy things are bad for money making. Both are bad in the respect mentioned, but they are not bad for that reason. Indeed, thinking itself is sometimes injurious to health. The view about pleasure that Aristotle criticizes is a view that assesses the goodness or badness of pleasure as a whole by reference to the health consequences induced by some pleasures. Health is treated as so good, unhealthiness as so evil, that the whole class of pleasures can be called bad because some pleasures are unhealthy. The mistake consists not only in judging the whole of pleasure by reference to a quality attaching to some pleasures, but also in supposing that health or unhealth is the mark or cause of something's being good or bad simply. In Aristotle's view, unhealthy pleasures are bad, but not on account of their being unhealthy. Thinking itself or contemplation is sometimes injurious to health, but not bad nevertheless. The view opposed to Aristotle on health is expressed concisely by Anaximandrus in Plato's Symposium. Next quotation there. So too, in the case of men's bodies, taken by themselves, is it a fine and needful thing to gratify the good and healthy things of each body. This is what has the name of the medical. But it is shameful to gratify the bad and sickly things, and one has to abstain from favoring them if one is to be skilled. It is needful or necessary, but also noble to bring about and augment the healthy operation of bodies by the human art of medicine, which understands and controls the natural forces that operate throughout the cosmos, but also within human bodies. We are skilled or artful in this judgment if we live by reference to our knowledge of the requirements of our bodies and the preservation of the noble balance or harmony of opposing tensions that obtain within them. With Anaximandrus, we today often come to venerate medicine as the intelligent route to living healthily, that is, to living well. Perhaps we come to regard health as the most secure part, if not the whole, of living well. It is not incidental when Aristotle denies that the healthy as such is the good and that the unhealthy as such is the bad. His dismissal of that nutritive dimension of the soul in Book 1, his recognition of the sometimes unhealthy character of contemplation in Book 7, are preparatory for his praise of moral virtue, specifically the virtue of courage, despite its sometimes leading to or resulting in death. It's also preparatory for his higher praise of the contemplative life, despite its appearing to be not quite a life fit for a human being, a political animal. Aristotle explicitly de-emphasizes the significance of bodily well-being in his account of human happiness as human excellence in the highest sense. For him, the goodness of health is not determined apart from the goods for which life and health are sometimes sacrificed. If the World Health Organization identifies health comprehensively as the total human good, Aristotle reduces health to almost nothing, at least in the beginning of his account. The natural response might be to try to find a middle ground, to try to articulate health as one goal, one good thing among others, or as a fundamental good that is open to a further completion by the higher human good. Contemporary efforts to work out such a middle definition of health have proven quite troublesome. For example, the President's Council on Bioethics has reviewed how difficult it is to articulate and maintain even a distinction between biotechnological interventions that aim at health therapeutically and those that aim at something better than mere health and enhancement. The Council's report articulates practical and conceptual difficulties in attempting to identify health with average qualities or with normal qualities, whether these are taken as statistically normal or as normatively ideal qualities. Additional difficulties arise when we try to identify what might pass for normal or healthy psychological qualities, and the relation of those traits to bodily substrates or conditions. Others too have attempted to deal with this problem and to identify what health is. One path is to try to identify health objectively or scientifically as a biological or non-moral phenomenon, and then to assess its goodness or badness independently. It makes some sense to regard health as basic or foundational, as something accessible beneath other important human goods. In the effort to grasp health in this manner, we would respect our recognition, for example, that whether one gets the flu or does not get the flu is largely, if not entirely, independent of one's moral standards or beliefs. Moreover, once one gets the flu, the natural history of that event proceeds with similar independence of the moral distinctions that divide human beings. Unfortunately, this sort of objective approach to health, this effort to identify it in a morally neutral manner, proves enormously difficult. Just a few years ago, the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy devoted an issue to efforts aimed at, as they called it, fashioning concepts of health and disease. The essays contained in that journal exhibit a widespread view that health and disease are irrevocably value-laden concepts. The essays come close to taking this for granted. They spend their energy rather on disputing the manner in which, or the degree to which, health and disease are value-laden concepts. The essays display the complexity of health as it appears in the interplay between physical or biological phenomena and the values or moral opinions and social attitudes through which biological phenomena are interpreted. It seems futile, ultimately, to attempt to understand health in a value-neutral manner. Still, it is instructive to read these sorts of analyses, at the very least because they help one to appreciate the magnitude of the challenge, even to understand clearly what we mean by health when we speak about health, or as the case may be, when we obsess about health. That's the first part. The second part, I want to add another layer of the difficulty by referring to some comments from Gadamer. There's 3 little texts on there too that I'll be appealing to shortly. Today I would like to focus our attention briefly on a different and less well-known dimension of the obstacle that awaits us when we, again, who want to be healthy, attempt to identify just what it is that we want. Hans Gadamer published a collection of essays under the title The Enigma of Health. Within that book, we find not only the claim that it is difficult to define health, that it is difficult to measure health, but also that health in principle recedes from our understanding. He writes, "Health is not something that is revealed through investigation, but rather something that manifests itself precisely by virtue of escaping our attention. We are not permanently aware of health. We do not anxiously carry it with us as we do an illness. It is not something which invites or demands permanent attention. Rather, it belongs to that miraculous capacity we have to forget ourselves." This reveals why medicine tends to focus on disease or illness and not on health. For medicine attempts to be objective, scientific knowledge of the character of the bodily experiences we first know in a less than fully rational way. Science has an easier time objectifying, in Gadamer's sense, a case of disease or illness. Gadamer again, "The fundamental fact remains that it is illness and not health which objectifies itself, which confronts us as something opposed to us, and which forces itself on us. Once again, we must address the fact that the real mystery lies in the hidden character of health. Health does not actually present itself to us. Of course, one can also attempt to establish standard values for health, but the attempt attempt to impose those standard values on a healthy individual would only result in making that person ill. It lies in the nature of health that it sustains its own proper balance and proportion. The appeal to standard values, which are derived by averaging out different empirical data and then simply applied to particular cases, is inappropriate to determining health and cannot be forced upon. Other people have made these observations. The key point that Gadamer wants to emphasize is the difference between health as produced by nature and health as it comes to be produced through scientific medicine. More on that in a moment. In Gadamer's account, health remains mysterious, hidden, out of sight, even not measurable. Medicine must treat or handle sick people, but this treatment remains always in service of nature, which produces this mysterious and subliminal health independent of our scientific medicine. With our science, we objectify cathartic illness or disease as something we want to master or defeat. According to Gadamer, medical science tends towards specialization and routinization that results in standard, rationalized, even automatic treatments of these objectified illnesses. The different manifestations of illness in individual subjects are fitted into fixed patterns. This focus on illness occurs in part because of that invisibility of health in the background of our conscious experience. Third text from him. Despite its hidden character, health nonetheless manifests itself in a general feeling of well-being. It shows itself above all where such a feeling of well-being means we are open to new things, ready to embark on new enterprises, and forgetful of ourselves, scarcely notice the demands and strains which are put on us. This is what health is. It does not consist in an increasing concern for every fluctuation in one's general physical condition or the eager consumption of prophylactic medicines. Clearly, Gadamer resists health obsession and argues for the very opposite, an unself-conscious inattention to one's bodily health. The emphasis is on involvement with the world and a certain obliviousness of the condition that makes that involvement possible. He likens health to the equilibrium or balance of contending forces that enables one to ride a bicycle. The key is that this equilibrium is not felt and not noticed when one learns to ride, except insofar as one notices the apparent cessation of the forces that you feel just before you fall. In the resultant equilibrium, when you're riding successfully, the forces are not gone, but they are no longer consciously experienced, and they are maintained without conscious effort. In the case of health, nature achieves this balance and maintains it. Medicine is the forceful attempt to rebalance and to return artfully to what nature originally established without knowledge, without art, and without force. Health as nature produces it, or better, as nature lets it be, is the rhythm of life, a permanent process in which equilibrium reestablishes itself. Gadamer seems to say that health is most what health is when it disappears from view. Again, he likens the mystery of health to the mystery or hiddenness of sleep. This never directly experienced function, sleep, like the rhythmic processes of health, sustains us in our very lives. He concludes by pointing out that we recognize in the hidden character of health the mystery of our nature as living beings. For what sustains our life separates us from death. That's a quotation of one sentence. The concern for health is somehow always also, according to Gadamer, the concern for our whole lives. Gadamer has then drawn our attention to the fact that medical science tends not to focus on health in the sense according to which he is identifying it, the sense in which health resists being made an object of our consciousness. In fact, he suggests that contemporary medicine, in its objectifying power and rationality, leads us to misconceive health. The tendency or inevitability of specialization inherent in the modern natural science that informs our medicine, our increasingly specialized medical science, presents a kind of obstacle to our focusing on health or on wholeness. Gadamer states that we found ourselves needing to learn to speak of wholeness only recently, once the effects of specialized scientific knowing made us aware that we had grown unaware of a less knowledgeable but more natural concern with living well. We now learn to speak of wholeness, to compensate for the loss that occurs when specialized scientific medicine identifies a person objectively as a case of Hodgkin's or a case of what have you. He says our natural concern with wholeness is the concern for what we, having lost, now designate with the artificial expression quality of life. This expression, even in its inadequacy, acknowledges the human concern and need to lead a life and not merely to continue metabolizing. The term quality of life has to be invented because the reality it points toward has been overlooked and has ceased being discussed. But human nature urges upon us even this purely formal designation. Indeed, Gadamer states that the goal of his whole reflection on sickness and health in this book is to bring to light the fundamental tension that arises for our scientifically grounded civilization. The suggestion he makes is that the rationality in which modern civilization is grounded causes us to lose sight of fundamental human concerns. Somehow, science itself contributes to our inability to recognize what we need to recognize as a vital concern to us in health. And that's now we'll move to the third part and pick up this suggestion he makes that it becomes clear when he's talking about this difference between the older way and the modern way of being concerned with these things if we focus on the different way in which we think about the good of human life. And I want to bring in juxtaposition a text from Plato and a text from Descartes, both of which identify health in ways that are similar and yet in illuminating respect very different. So I turn away from Gadamer's paper and consider how we are to think about health in this context. Efforts to define what health is have proven elusive. Gadamer himself has argued with some force that health is not even something that appears to us, without at the same time remaining primarily and inescapably beyond our awareness. If health remains enigmatic, as he says, it seems very difficult to know how we who are concerned with health are to be properly concerned with it and to avoid becoming health-obsessed. But if it is true that health cannot be identified objectively, that is, without entangling us in values and conflicts of values, and if it is true that health cannot even be brought fully to conscious presence, perhaps we ought not try to do, or even wish to do, what we have come to realize we cannot do. Instead of trying to understand what health is, perhaps we ought to try to approach health again from the perspective from which it first became a concern for us. Perhaps, that is, we should refrain from asking what health is without first concentrating on the goodness of health. I say this fully aware that there are difficulties in this approach too. If we, like Socrates in the Republic, leave off from the investigation of what something is and turn instead to the investigation of whether that something is good or how good it is relative to other things. But this is the approach I'm suggesting. I'll offer just a sketch of an argument in support of it. The approach I'm suggesting takes seriously the fact that healthy is, for us, first of all, something that we want to be, and not something that we want to understand. Our primary grasp of health is in its goodness, or as something good for us, and not as an item for contemplation. Our concern with health is primarily practical, only secondarily cognitive or intellectual. Even board-certified oncologists get cancer. The sick are not made healthy by knowing their illness. It is not the case that we require a theoretical grasp of what health is, then we happen to notice that it's good, and then we evaluate it as good relative to other concerns. We don't move from an originally neutral and foundational knowledge of health towards later practicality. That approach should be the proper way to think about health as a kind of illusion that we might find persuasive because we are so familiar with the distinction between what we regard as the foundational theoretical sciences and the uses of the apparently pure knowledge we derive from them in the applied sciences. The difficulties in attaining a pure or objective knowledge of health that I have reviewed above help to encourage us to pay more attention to the fact that for us the first awareness of health is as something good, and thus it is in its goodness that health first becomes accessible to our understanding. That's my argument sketch. I want to consider now these two possible ways of conceiving that goodness of health. Gadamer's reflections point to a fundamental difference between ancient and modern approaches. With this clue from him, I turn first to the Republic, second to Descartes' discourse on method. Each text identifies health as a good, but not as the only good. Each identifies health as the basis or foundation for some other goods. In contemporary language, this might lead to health's designation as a first-order good relative to second-order goods or functions that become possible in consequence of health. To the Republic, then. At the beginning of the second book, Socrates narrates that Glaucon asked whether he, Socrates, recognized each of three classes of good. Your text has this passage. Tell me, is there, in your opinion, a kind of good that we would choose to have, not because we desire its consequences, but because we delight in it for its own sake, such as enjoyment and all the pleasures which are harmless and leave no after effects other than the enjoyment and having them? In my opinion, at least, I, Socrates, said, there is a good of this kind. Glaucon asks again, and what about this? Is there a kind we like both for its own sake and for what comes out of it, such as thinking and seeing and being healthy? Surely we delight in such things on both accounts. Yes, I said. Do you see a third form of the good, which includes gymnastic exercise and medical treatment when sick, as well as the practice of medicine, and the rest of the activities from which money is made? We would say that they are drudgery, but beneficial to us. We would not choose to have them for themselves, but for the sake of the wages and whatever else comes out of them. Yes, there is also this third, I said. Health or being healthy is doubly delightful. Medicine is drudgery. Medicine and doctors and treatment come to be only because health has first appeared as good. Health's recognized goodness leads to its being targeted by human art, by our effort to understand health so as to be able to produce it or reproduce it where nature has failed. But there are also goods beyond health, and health's goodness is recognized also in connection with those goods. Socrates identifies this second of the three classes of goods later as the finest class. Now let's look at the passage from Descartes. This is from part 6 of the discourse. As soon as I had acquired some general notions regarding physics, beginning to test them in various particular difficulties, I had noticed where they could lead, how much they differ from the principles that had been in use up to the present. I believed I could not keep them hidden away without sinning grievously against the law that obliges us to procure, as much as is in our power, the common good of all men. For these notions made me see that it is possible to arrive at knowledge that would be very useful in life, and that in place of the speculative philosophy taught in the schools, it's possible to find a practical philosophy by means of which, knowing the force and the actions of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies that surround us, just as distinctly as we know the various skills of our craftsmen, we might be able in the same way to use them for all the purposes for which they are appropriate, and thus render ourselves, as it were, masters and possessors of nature. This is desirable not only for the invention of an infinity of devices that would enable one to enjoy trouble-free the fruits of the earth and all the goods found there, but also principally for the maintenance of health, which unquestionably is the first good, the foundation of all the other goods in this life. For even the mind depends so greatly on the temperament and on the disposition of the organs of the body that if it is possible to find some means to render men generally more wise and more adroit than they have been up until now, I believe that one should look for it in medicine. This famous passage is familiar both as a text and because the argument Descartes advances has become successful and has structured our world. We recognize immediately the utilization of knowledge for human benefit. That is, the theme of human mastery of nature through science for the common benefit of all human beings. This humanitarian character of scientific endeavor is orientation towards securing all the goods of this life for all human beings. And the prominence of medicine in this project features are by now long established in the modern world. I wish to direct attention specifically to the identification here of health as the first good and the foundation of all other goods of this life. This bears more than a passing resemblance to the identification by Glaucon of health as something we like both for its own sake and for what comes out of it. Each passage identifies health as good in a twofold manner. Yet there remains a tremendous difference between the two accounts of the goodness of health because of the differences between the context in which the two passages occur. For a disclaimer at this point, Republic, the Discourse are two incredibly complex works, and I can't do justice to them perhaps at any time, but certainly not here. I do think I can get away with this comparison, though, on the point of health to try to bring some clarification on what it means to focus on the goodness of health. The situation in the Republic can best be clarified by comparing what is said about health with the treatment of justice in the rest of the book. Socrates states that it is his belief that justice is in the same category of good as being healthy. Justice is the sort of good one likes both for itself and for what comes out of it. Nevertheless, in the dialogue, Glaucon demands that Socrates praise justice and say what it is all alone by itself when it is in the soul, without regard to its consequences. Glaucon and his brother Adeimantus want to see justice itself praised as the greatest good, apart from the reputations and honors and rewards that might follow on its basis. Adeimantus explicitly distinguishes justice itself from what comes as a result of justice, and he demands that Socrates address only the goodness of justice itself. In fact, Adeimantus distorts Socrates' classification of justice by claiming that Socrates had said that justice is good for what comes from it, but, quote, much more for itself. Adeimantus and Glaucon are, we might say, justice obsessed. They want to think about the goodness of justice in isolation from what justice makes possible. They urge Socrates to think about something that is good in itself, but also good for the sake of other things, as if it were exclusively and primarily a good in itself. They force a distorted account of justice. There is little wonder that Socrates at first responds by saying that he cannot do what they want. Eventually, he agrees to help so far as he is able, but that's not quite the same thing as endorsing their plan. As you know, the character of justice in the Republic is, to say the least, surprising. I'd like to suggest that part of the strangeness of the doctrine of justice that follows, that unfolds in the Republic, arises because of the abstract starting point, which falsifies the manner in which justice is good. The attempt to articulate justice as a human good, or as the greatest human good, and as good for human beings apart from relation to other goods that become possible through it, results in a shocking or even monstrous picture of justice. One bit of evidence that supports my claim we ought to notice this distortion that arises in the beginning appears in the analogy of the idea of the sun to the good. If the idea of the good is like the sun in the sense that we orient ourselves and find our way by reference to each of these, then the approach urged on us and Socrates by Glaucon and his brother, is a defective approach from the very beginning. We are asked to close our eyes deliberately to the full meaning of the good and to focus on just a part as if it were the whole, or as if that part were intelligible in isolation from the whole. If this procedure ends in failure and ends there necessarily, we come to recognize that we cannot focus on a good like justice in this way. If it is true, then, that health is the same sort of good that justice is, we cannot approach health this way either. That is to say, not apart from a consideration of the good or the human good, or at least the good insofar as it is available in and through health. The question of the more comprehensive good for human beings, the end of human life, the good that becomes possible on the condition of health, becomes the primary question. For only in view of this more comprehensive end can we establish the character and limits of the goodness of health. By contrast, we are misled if we think that it is better and simpler to begin by isolating what seems to be a more fundamental question, such as what is health, or how is health itself good. You might believe that we should begin with these sorts of questions because they admit more widespread agreement, or because they are less controversial. The plan would be to get clear about health as the common basis from which we would then pursue higher or second-order goods. On this view, we could defer contentious issues about the nature of human happiness until a later time, after we have reached agreement about the more basic, elemental good of health. Now, if the analogy between the goodness of health and of justice holds, we would expect, actually, for this approach to lead to problems. And I do think it leads to problems, or maybe better, problems arise, or problems may become manifest in two sorts of ways once we begin this approach. Before identifying those two ways that the problems with this approach show up, I want to point out that the approach just described to health as a fundamental good is essentially the approach identified by Descartes in the sixth part of the discourse. Again, despite the similarity between Descartes' description of the goodness of health and Glaucon's, the context made crucial differences. In Descartes' case, the context is decisively shaped by the introduction of his scientific method in Part 2. That method, in turn, necessitates, in Part 3, an auxiliary set of practical and moral maxims to guide his conduct provisionally, while he's undergoing the radical and methodical revision in his thinking. These 3 or 4 maxims of morality, provisional morality, are embraced not because they are true or believed to be true, but because they are useful. Descartes presents the rules of his method as the route to certainty in thinking, and the route to overcoming of doubt. What is not known through method is doubtful, and is regarded by Descartes as if it were false. Exceptions to these rigorous rules for thinking are necessary for practical matters, and it is in order to meet the practical demands of life that Descartes introduces the provisional moral maxims that are derived from that method. The rigor of the method has rendered doubtful all of his practical opinions. Nevertheless, he resolves by an act of will to follow some opinions as suitable for governing his actions, whether those opinions should be regarded as true or not. The quotation on the text where he mentions health, where he addresses the goodness of health, appears in the sixth part of the discourse after these issues have been settled. Central concern in the sixth part of the discourse is an argument about a specific practical question, whether Descartes should publish the book that you're reading in the sixth part. These observations about the structure of the discourse contribute to showing that Descartes treats the matter of the goodness of health rhetorically, not scientifically, not philosophically. In the sixth part, Descartes advances this thesis about health as something that is held to be true by very many people. Similarly, he also mentions and appears even to endorse what he refers to as the law we are obliged to procure the common good, so far as that is in our power. Needless to say, neither this law nor any other specific law was endorsed among his maxims of morality, which are, again, provisional. And they are derived not from some fundamental moral imperative by which he is bound, but from his own project of attempting to reform his thoughts. Moreover, that attempt to order his thoughts casts a decisive shadow over all opinion as in principle unreliable. Opinion is not to be taken seriously in our pursuit of truth. It's to be regarded only for its practical utility. Descartes then advances his thesis about the goodness of health as one point of agreement that obtains among many people who nevertheless disagree about the ultimate meaning and goal of human life. That is, all or almost all people are likely to agree that health is good, even though they disagree decisively about what health is good for and what goods one should pursue on the basis of health. It is unnecessary to move or to attempt to move from this widely held opinion about the truth of health. Descartes simply uses the belief in all its cognitive imperfection rhetorically. The widespread belief to which Descartes appeals does genuinely exist. He gave some evidence of its contemporary power at the beginning of this talk. In consequence of this widely held belief, we come also to believe that health is a good about which people agree. these are the two ways in which the difficulty inherent in this approach that I mentioned a minute ago appear. First, in the actual practice of delivering health care, our lack of precision regarding what health is leads to difficulties. For example, do we understand the following actions of physicians as directed to the promotion of health? Physician-assisted suicide, cosmetic surgery, fertility interventions aimed at producing children with particular features like deafness, and add the amputation for people who desire to have a differently shaped body than the one that they have. Again, much as the distorted focus on justice led to the dissolution of the family, one can easily find health-based arguments on fertility interventions that challenge the goodness of the family today. In the practical sphere, it is not uncommon to replace a physician-defined or politically defined understanding of health with the patient's own understanding of health, that is, ultimately with the patient's own beliefs and values, or what might be called autonomy. The opinions or values on which people act are weakened or evacuated of any claim to truth because of their being contrasted with the scientific knowing that informs medicine. No single view or opinion regarding the good claims any authority in healthcare. To say that is tantamount to saying that medicine is ordered to serve autonomy and not to the restoration, preservation, and promotion of health. That's the first way. Practical route leads to problems in this approach. Second way in which the difficulty inherent in the opinion to which Descartes appeals becomes manifest. When bioethicists attempt to replace the vague notion of health with a precise and non-arbitrary notion of health. The actual course of these sorts of discussions in the bioethics literature, which I had mentioned above, reveals apparently insoluble difficulties. In fact, the attempt to define what health is leads one to questions of what are called values and to conflicts of value. And according to the judgment of the editor of the issue, Journal of Medicine and Philosophy I mentioned, the last text on your paper there, to define concepts of health, illness, and disease, that is, which complaints and general circumstances ought to be medically construed so as to be understood as licitly within medical authority, one must appeal to more than the nature of reality. Appeal must also be made to particular values and interests to ground standards of normal behavior and functional body states. Yet it is the very availability of standards which is at issue. Given the apparent, in principle, impossibility of general secular reason to disclose a unique set of contemptible moral norms, to establish a canonical account of the common good, particular views of human good will only be found within particular moral communities, wherein a specific moral ethos and value framework will define appropriate relationships among individuals, communities, society, and state. Within such communities, there will be content and moral authority to determine which commitment should inform definitions of health and disease. Outside of such communities, there will likely be no unique set of values and norms to guide canonical, contemptible accounts of health and disease with which to guide public policy. If that is the proper conclusion, we seem to be in an impossible situation. Our attempts to clarify health as the good about which most or all people agree leads us into the very complex about the ultimate good that are available on the basis of health. But it was in order to avoid just these conflicts that we concentrated on the goodness of health as something simpler and more elemental. Moreover, Plato seems to have taught us that it is necessary to begin not at the most basic level, but higher at the level of the good that enables us to see what sort of good health is and the limits on its goodness. If it is irrational to attempt what Plato suggests we should attempt, we seem to be at a genuine impasse. Perhaps we understand the situation better than Plato did, but it is not likely that Plato taught us to begin at this higher level if he too believed that a rational discrimination of the good at this level were impossible. It is equally unlikely that Aristotle so strictly subordinated the question of the goodness of health to higher questions regarding human happiness if he believed that reason were incapable of discerning the genuine good. The real difficulty that we face, then, is whether reason can penetrate questions about the good, or these questions must be decided by communal or individual acts of will. Descartes himself brings his discourse to light in public as an argument of limits of his method is an argument about the nature of the good for human beings. The rhetorical character of the argument he uses, as well as the character of the arguments brought forward by Plato and Aristotle, should suggest to us that we ought not to expect all human beings to reach uniform agreement on these matters. That is, the persistence of disagreement about the comprehensive human good is to be expected, and it carries with it no proof that the good cannot be known. Perhaps Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes have foolishly overestimated the power of human reason. Perhaps we enjoy decisive superiority over them in knowing the limits of reason. In any case, this is the point to which we are led when we try to decipher the goodness of health. In view of the result to which contemporary efforts to discern health lead, is it not appropriate to open up again this older avenue to these questions, perhaps by beginning more naively with our necessarily practical concern for our lives and our good, and without presupposing the limits of reason to discern the genuine good, we can gain some insight into the goodness of health. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions or comments, please come up to the microphone. Anybody?
It's the perfect clarity.
Great. All right. Well, let's thank Dr. Maher for coming. Okay, I have just a few logistical notes. First, Dr. Wright has written a book called Mother Teresa's Prescription, Finding Happiness in Peace and Service, and he's brought a copy for everyone, and they're available in the tables back kind of towards the registration desk. Don't take that off the bookstore. They really might get mad. And he will be available the whole weekend if you'd like to meet him and discuss with him. And we'll be happy to sign any of those books for you. So just pick one of those up. Second, if you haven't already figured out what group you're in, the number is on the back of your name tag. And the room is